Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Captain Patriotic. How's everybody doing? I realize it's been a long time since we last talked, and I apologize for not posting content in the last few months. Let's just say it's been a crazy, hectically busy last few months to where I honestly haven't had a whole lot of time to myself. There's been so much going on at work lately to where that's preoccupied most all of my time. And I've also been dealing with the loss of my grandmother pretty heavily. So thank you everybody for your patience with me in all of this. I didn't want to put off posting content for so long, but with everything that's been going on lately, I didn't have much of a choice. But anyway, I'm finally on the other side of all of this, and I'm more than happy to get back in the saddle and bring you some fresh new content. So, for this long awaited video, I want to draw our attention to the most decorated U.S. Army general in United States history in honor of the United States Army birthday this month in mid-June, as well as to commemorate the anniversary of the start of the Korean War on June 25th, 1950. And as you'll see later on in this video, you'll see why this particular individual is tied so heavily to both of those points. There's been a ton of individuals that have served in the U.S. Army, and quite frankly, the U.S. Army is by far the largest military branch in the United States military, and for good reason. The Army has served in every major and minor conflict that the United States has served in ever since the start of the Revolutionary War in 1775. There's a lot of history with the Army. Basically, the U.S. Army is among the main infantry divisions and organizations that are deployed overseas to a war zone whenever we declare war on our enemies. So, naturally, with the Army being as big as it is today, there have been a lot of individuals that have become highly decorated for various actions in the U.S. Army. Well, today, I'm focusing not just on enlisted personnel. The most decorated U.S. soldier for general infantry and all that is still Audie Murphy, where he received every possible decoration for valor that the U.S. Army awarded its members during World War II. Instead, I want to shift our focus to another subsection of the U.S. Army and recognize the most decorated U.S. Army general to ever serve in our armed forces. Now, that particular honor goes to none other than Arkansas native and Medal of Honor recipient General Douglas MacArthur of Little Rock, Arkansas. You guys have probably heard his name before, but General MacArthur is an icon in the history books today, and for a very good reason. Whether you've seen him portrayed in movies, or you've heard of his tall tales of serving overseas in so many different wars, to other things that pertain to this iconic individual. Well, today we're going to take a deep dive into his backstory that helped him to become the most iconic as well as the most decorated U.S. Army general in U.S. history. So, our story begins in 1880, where on January 26th, Douglas MacArthur was born to Captain Arthur MacArthur and his wife, Mary Pinckney Hardy. Now, his father at the time, Captain Arthur MacArthur, was a career Army gentleman and had a long distinctive career. As well, he has the dubious honor of being a Medal of Honor recipient during the Civil War. Along with serving in the Civil War, Douglas MacArthur's father also served in the Indian Wars out west, as well as both the Spanish-American as well as the Philippine-American Wars at the turn of the century. He earned the Medal of Honor for his role as a Union flag bearer during the Battle of Missionary Hill in Chattanooga, Tennessee, during November of 1863. The MacArthur's stay in Little Rock was not very long at all. In fact, Douglas MacArthur, as well as his other siblings and his mother and father, were only in Little Rock for 6 months before he was reassigned to duty in New Mexico. So, for most of his childhood, Douglas MacArthur basically moved with his family to different Army bases around the country. And sometimes him and his mother and siblings would stay in a particular place while his father was being deployed overseas somewhere. Now, despite all of this, his father's tales of heroism and actions in various battles, like during the Civil War, would actually encourage Douglas himself to go on to become an Army man himself. In fact, in 1899, Douglas MacArthur would enter the military academy at West Point, and fast forward 4 years later, in 1903, Douglas would become valedictorian, or the top of his graduating class. After his graduation from West Point, and as a junior officer in the years leading up to World War I, he was stationed in the Philippines as well as in different bases around the United States. He even served as an aide to his father in the Far East, and his first action that he really participated in was during the American occupation of Veracruz in Mexico. It was in 1914, during that occupation, that he conducted a reconnaissance mission with him and a bunch of Army buddies, and it was for this action that he was nominated for the Medal of Honor his first time. So, early on in his career, even right as and before he saw major action, he was already a well-liked individual, he was a great student, and he was well respected like his father before him. In fact, a lot of Army personnel at the time saw him as being a major iconic leader later on in his life, which would come to be true. So fast forward 3 years, and it was after the U.S. declared war on Germany during that time that MacArthur would be put in charge of helping lead the 42nd Rainbow Division in France, where he was eventually promoted to Brigadier General to help manage and lead all these men in the 42nd Division. And it goes without saying, but once him and the 42nd Division deployed to France and started participating in World War I, he became a very distinguished Army officer, in the very least. Some of it in the traditional sense, and some of it in the not-so-traditional sense, because he believed in being there in the heat of battle with his men to encourage and rally them, and to basically lead by example for scared troops that were fighting on the front lines. And it was because of this personality that he would go on to participate in the various battles that the American Expeditionary Forces participated in during World War I, which include the following battles: the Champagne-Marne Offensive, the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, as well as the final Moose Argonne offensive, which was considered not only America, but the Allies' last major offense of the war before Germany surrendered and the war ended in November of 1918. Because he saw a lot of action, and he was in the trenches with all of the doughboys and what have you, MacArthur became a highly, highly decorated soldier and officer because he saw lots of combat. This further proved and cemented his status as a very effective leader. Now, for his service during World War I, General MacArthur was decorated with 2 U.S. Army Distinguished Service Crosses. I know we've covered this before, but that is a very big deal because the Distinguished Service Cross is the U.S. Army's second highest military honor that is awarded to individuals for valor in action or combat, basically going above and beyond the call of duty. And it's only second to the Medal of Honor. Now, the first of his Distinguished Service Crosses was earned while he was leading raids against the Germans in the Luneville sector of France during March of 1918. His second Distinguished Service Cross was awarded for helping lead and carry out various attacks with the 42nd Infantry Division during that iconic Moose Argonne offensive between October 14th and 16th, 1918. That's a pretty big deal in itself, you guys. 2 Distinguished Service Crosses. That shows you that he's already a brave and gutsy individual. And in my mind's eye, that is the equivalent of 1 Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. That is amazing. But that he wasn't done, though. He was decorated for other actions during World War I as well. In fact, he would go on to earn 7, that's right, 7 Silver Star medals, which is the 3rd highest military award given to any branch of the U.S. Armed Forces for bravery. And those 7 Silver Star medals were for various actions during all of the campaigns he participated in during the war. A lot of times, even though he was a commander, he would be in the trenches, and he would, by leading by example, he would put his own life at risk to go out in the field into heavy machine gun fire to rally his troops and to encourage them to repel enemy attacks. He would go well above to set an example for his men, and in this case, he was rightfully decorated on several occasions. That's pretty badass if you ask me. Now, in addition to his 2 Distinguished Service Crosses and 7 Silver Star medals, he was also awarded what is called a U.S. Army Distinguished Service Medal for his service as the Chief of Staff for the 42nd Infantry Division, as well as for serving as commander of the 84th Infantry Division. In addition to this Army Distinguished Service Medal, MacArthur would also be awarded 2 Purple Hearts for being gassed with poisonous mustard gas on 2 separate occasions. Now, guys, if this doesn't show commitment and a bold leader, I don't know what is. This is pretty awesome, and this is almost unheard of for any individual that served in the trenches of World War I. But to not only serve and be present for all of these major battles during the Great War, but also to be decorated on several occasions like he has. At this point, he has 10 or 12 medals to his name. That's pretty dang impressive for a young officer in the Army. That is really, really impressive. That just cemented him as a bold and courageous leader for not only himself and his higher-ups, but for the men below him. Everybody, even as early as World War One and beyond, before all this, they really looked up to him. And I can honestly see why, because he was really gutsy and he was very selfless with all these actions. All these honors were very well deserved, I could only imagine. But anyway, after World War One ended in 1918, he would come back to the States for his service during the first part of the interwar years. And in fact, from 1919 until 1922, Douglas MacArthur served as the superintendent of West Point, his alma mater, and instituted a variety of reforms intended to modernize the school based off of his World War I experience. In 1930, Hubert Huber named MacArthur Chief of Staff of the Army, where he was given the rank of general. It was during this role that MacArthur sent Army troops to remove the so-called bonus army of unemployed World War I veterans from D.C. in 1932. That incident was a PR disaster for both MacArthur and the military, based off of how they treated the veterans that served greatly during World War I. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that right now, but look it up sometime. You might be fascinated by what led up to this particular event. A few years later, in 1935, after finishing his term as Chief of Staff, which he would be awarded his second U.S. Army Distinguished Service Medal, MacArthur was tasked with creating an armed force for the Philippines, which at that time was considered a territory of the United States. And by doing so, it became a Commonwealth of the United States in 1936, before ultimately gaining its independence after World War II in 1946. It was in 1937, upon learning he was scheduled to return for duty in the United States, that MacArthur boldly resigned from the military, stating that his mission wasn't finished in the Philippines, and in fact he remained there as a civilian advisor to the then President of the Philippines, Manuel Quezon, who had appointed him Field Marshal of the Philippines. So he was in a happy place in his life. He was a very well-decorated war veteran, highly respected, not only in the United States, but abroad too, in the Philippines and in the Pacific in general at this point. Fast forward to 1941, and with expansionist Japan posing an increasing threat, MacArthur was recommended to and actually recalled to active duty with the U.S. military, and thus named commander of U.S. Army forces in the Far East. On December 8, 1941, his Air Force was destroyed in a surprise attack by the Japanese, who would soon invade his second home of the Philippines. Now, MacArthur's forces, upon this invasion, they retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. Basically, it was down in this little tiny corner of the island, the main island in the Philippines, where they struggled to survive for months and months on end until they could get reinforcements and help from the U.S. military. In fact, things got so dire that in March of 1942, on orders from then-President Franklin Roosevelt, MacArthur, his family, and members of his immediate staff fled Corregidor Island in U.S. Navy PT boats and escaped to Australia because the Japanese forces were becoming too strong in the region and thus really dangerous for him and his family. But ultimately, U.S. and Philippine forces would fall to the Japanese in May of 1942. But during April 1942, MacArthur, in the safety of Australia, was appointed to Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the whole Southwest Pacific and awarded the biggest honor that anybody could receive in the U.S. military, the Congressional Medal of Honor, for his defense of the Philippines in those first few months of the war. And it's with great privilege that I read his Medal of Honor citation as follows. The President of the United States of America, in the name of Congress, takes pleasure in presenting the Medal of Honor to General of the Armies Douglas MacArthur, United States Army, for conspicuous leadership in preparing the Philippine Islands to resist conquest, for gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action against invading Japanese forces, and for the heroic conduct of defense and offensive operations on the Bataan Peninsula. General MacArthur mobilized, trained, and led an army which has received world acclaim for its gallant defense against a tremendous superiority of enemy forces in men and arms. His utter disregard of personal danger under heavy fire and aerial bombardment, his calm judgment in each crisis, inspired his troops, galvanized the spirit of the resistance of the Filipino people, and confirmed the faith of the American people in their armed forces. All of his military training and experience from the previous World War would lead him to earn this great honor for basically doing everything in his power, combined with his past experiences, to put up a really good fight, essentially, in the Philippines before they were forced out of there by the Japanese. He was basically the brains of the whole operation in the Philippines, and he knew that area like the back of his hand. There was no way in hell he was going to let an enemy take over his home country, or I should say, his second home. This honor was very well deserved, and you guys have got to read up on this a little bit more because it's a very fascinating story. I mean, it takes just the right kind of person to do what he did in the face of adversity and danger like that. It's just crazy. So, after he was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1942, MacArthur spent the next 2.5 years commanding an island hopping campaign in the Pacific before famously returning to liberate his Philippines in October of 1944. Waiting ashore at Leyte, he announced, "I have arrived. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil." In December of 1944, he was promoted to the rank of General of the Army and soon given command of all U.S. Army forces in the Pacific Theater. On September 2nd, 1945, after the bombs were dropped at Nagasaki and Hiroshima on Japan, MacArthur was among the individuals that officially accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, which ended World War II entirely. Now, besides his Congressional Medal of Honor, General MacArthur was also awarded other medals for valor and conduct for his service during the Pacific of World War II. The other medals that he earned for his World War II service include the following. He was awarded a Third Army Distinguished Service Cross whenever he led by example and served as inspiration for members of the 25th Infantry Division while they were fighting during the Battle of Luzon for 3 weeks to reclaim Manila from Japan. Basically, he was there as an observer, and whenever they were pinned down by a machine gun, he would, without hesitation, go out in the middle of an open battlefield and explain and rally to his men where to go to take down this machine gun nest. It was very bold of him to do that, even then, as a Medal of Honor recipient, because a lot of times, whenever someone earns the Medal of Honor like that, they are, by law, cannot most of the time go back into combat or action because of them possibly being killed. I guess rules were different back then, but that didn't stop him, though. He was still there for his men, and he would do anything for them. So this third Distinguished Service Cross was very well deserved for helping his men fight during the Philippine campaign of 1945. In addition to that, he was also awarded a Bronze Star Medal while helping his men defend Papua New Guinea from the Japanese in 1943. He was also awarded, ironically, an Air Medal for successfully guiding a flight of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Division on September 4th, 1943, as well as 2 more U.S. Army Distinguished Service Medals. The first of those Distinguished Service Medals was awarded for the following: as his role of Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Southwest Pacific since March of 1942, under extreme difficult conditions of terrain, climate, and limited forces and material, he expelled the enemy from eastern New Guinea, secured lodgments on the island of New Britain, and gave strategic direction to coordinated operations resulting in the conquest of the New Georgia Group and the establishment of U.S. Army and Navy forces on Bougainville Island. His inflicted heavy losses on the enemy and established his forces in positions highly favorable for the construction of offensive operations. His second Distinguished Service Medal for World War II was awarded for him because during the period from October 20th, 1944 until July 4th, 1945, as Supreme Commander of Allied Air, Ground, and Sea Forces in the Southwest Pacific, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur planned and personally directed the campaigns which resulted in the ultimate liberation of the Philippine Islands. Along with these Army Distinguished Service Medals, he was ironically also awarded a U.S. Navy Distinguished Service Medal for exceptional, meritorious, and distinguished service in a position of great responsibility to the government of the United States in a position of great responsibility in the Southwest Pacific area from February to October 1944 as Supreme Commander of all Allied Air, Ground, and Sea Forces in the Southwest Pacific. So, I say all this to mean he was a highly decorated man even during World War II and very well respected. I mean, all service members, regardless of military branch, they looked up to him so highly because he was very respected and put his men first. Now, after the end of World War II in September of 1945, he would go on to serve as the Allied commander of the Japanese occupation forces, where he helped to oversee the successful demobilization of Japan's military forces, as well as the restoration of the economy, the drafting of a new United States-like constitution, as well as other reforms to help modernize Japan after the Second World War. He had a lot on his plate, to say the very least, but He wasn't done, though, making his mark on history, because in June 1950, whenever communist forces from North Korea invaded the Western Allied Republic of South Korea, that ultimately launched what is known as today as the Korean War, just a mere 5 years after World War II ends. Whenever the Korean War breaks out in 1950, Douglas MacArthur was put in charge of the American-led coalition of United Nations troops. And although the war in Korea was almost over before it started, he planned another ambiguous landing just like he used in World War II. This particular landing became known as the Battle of Incheon, which is another iconic U.S. Marine battle, by the way. It was during the mid to late part of September 1950, during the Battle of Incheon, where U.S. Marines invaded Incheon and eventually moved to take back control of the South Korean capital of Seoul. The plan was so successful that the Marines basically took over Incheon as well as Seoul in a matter of 2 weeks. And it was due to the success of this operation that further affirmed his ability as a supreme leader in 2 theaters of a war, not only in World War II, but now in Korea. He was well liked among the public for his military actions like this, and a lot of people could see why they loved MacArthur so much. So, after U.S. Marine, American, and other UN forces take over Seoul from the Chinese and the North Koreans, UN troops continued to repel the North Koreans and eventually, over the next few months, drove them back toward the Chinese border. It was during that time that MacArthur, as the supreme leader of all UN forces in Korea, he met with President Truman, who worried that the communist government of the People's Republic of China might view their invasion as a hostile act and intervene in the conflict. It was after this discussion that General MacArthur assured him that the chances of a Chinese intervention were very slim. However, he didn't realize what was coming. Then, in November and December of 1950, a massive force of Chinese troops crossed into North Korea and flung themselves against the UN and American lines, slowly driving back U.S. forces back into South Korea. It was after this little stint that MacArthur asked permission to bomb China and to use national Chinese forces from Taiwan against the People's Republic of China. Let's just say this wasn't received very well because President Truman flatly refused those requests, which ultimately led to a public dispute between the two men. In fact, things got so bad between Truman and MacArthur that on April 11th, 1951, Truman would officially relieve MacArthur from his command for this insubordination. And in an address to the Americans that day, President Truman stated, "I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons. To make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and then to prevent a third world war." MacArthur at that point had been fired. After that, he said, "So that there may not be no doubt or confusion as the real purpose and aim of our policy." Now, that was probably the biggest stain on an otherwise spotless U.S. Army career, but despite all of this controversy at the end, he too was also decorated for his service in the Korean War, and was again well respected by the men that served with and under him. His particular decorations for his service in Korea include his fifth and final U.S. Army Distinguished Service Medal for his distinguished service to the peoples of the United States and the Republic of Korea and to the peoples of all free nations, having been designated as the first field commander of United Nations Armed Forces and directed in the common interest to repel an armed attack upon the Republic of Korea and to restore international peace and security in the area, he has given these forces conspicuously brilliant and courageous leadership and discerning judgment of the highest order, having been compelled to commit his troops to combat under extremely adverse conditions and against heavy odds in order to gain the time to imperatively needed to build up his forces for the counteroffensive. He has so inspired his command by his vision, his judgment, his will, and his unshakable faith that it has set a shining example of gallantry and tenacity in defense of audacity, an attack matched by but few operations in military history. His conduct has been in accord with the highest traditions of the military service of the United States and is deserving of the enduring gratitude of the freedom-loving peoples of the world. Basically, what that's saying is this was for his service in the first year, practically, of the Korean War as the supreme UN allied commander of all forces. He basically oversaw everything in the beginning stages of the Korean War. In addition to his final Army Distinguished Service Medal, ironically, he was also awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross, and he was awarded this Flying Cross for commanding several and numerous UN and Allied flights during Korea between June 29th and October 20th, 1950. All of these aerial flights in an unarmed aircraft were made by General MacArthur in furtherance of his mission as commander of the United Nations forces in Korea. Each flight involved the risk of death or capture by the enemy. In General MacArthur's case, this risk was multiplied 100-fold in view of his personal stature and position as Commander-in-Chief. That General MacArthur unhesitantly took part in these extraordinary, important, and dangerous missions is a further demonstration of the unflattering devotion to duty which categorizes his every action as a leader. So, in other words, by the time his career was winding down in Korea, MacArthur was awarded a litany of awards, and a lot of them was very well deserved because he was such an outgoing individual. Most all of these were very well deserved. So, after MacArthur is essentially let go by President Truman, him and his wife took up residence in a suite at New York City's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. In fact, in 1952, there were calls for MacArthur to run for president on the Republican side. However, as history has already told us, the party would ultimately choose Dwight Eisenhower, who would go on to win in the general election of 1952. It was during that same year, though, that MacArthur became chairman of Remington Rand, a maker of electronic equipment and other business machines. He did that for several years until he finally retired in the mid-50s. And he would live a quiet rest of his life. Ultimately, General MacArthur would die at the ripe old age of 84 on April 5th, 1964, at Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. After this, he was ultimately buried at the MacArthur Memorial located in Norfolk, Virginia. Wow, guys. I just have to say, that is a very, very iconic story for such an iconic man in the U.S. Armed Forces. For having a career in the Army spanning over 50 years, he went to a lot of places and he's seen a lot of action. And he was a very well respected man and officer. I can't tell you how this man managed everything that he did, but just reading about his story is so inspiring. Here is a list of all of his military medals that you can pause and read at your own speed. But in summary, he was a very highly decorated individual. In fact, his most notable military decorations include the following: the Congressional Medal of Honor, 3 Army Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Army Distinguished Service Medals, a Navy Distinguished Service Medal, 7 Silver Star Medals, a Bronze Star Medal, 2 Purple Hearts, an Air Medal, and a Distinguished Flying Cross Medal, among the other various American and foreign campaign medals that he participated in. So guys, I hope you appreciate the life and legend that is General Douglas MacArthur. I think he really does represent the U.S. Army very well in a time where the Army was transitioning into a formidable force, and it has since then become the fighting force that we have known or should know to this day. Now, this sets us up to my upcoming mini-series that I am launching, where I focus on many different aspects of the Korean War. Today we were just scratching the surface of that, but if you'll tune in for the following episodes, I'll go into much more detail about America's Forgotten War. As always, guys, if you like this content, please leave a like and subscribe, and please stick around for next time. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day.